I lived the first 17 years of my life unconsciously. I didn't realize that my characteristic ways of feeling, thinking, believing, behaving, and the outcomes that I had because of them were all programmed into me through socialization. Socialization is the process through which you're socialized to think, feel, believe, and act in certain ways because of your friends, family, other people, and culture, as well as the institutional, systemic, and structural backdrop of society. I know that was a mouthful, but if you don't become aware of your socialization and how to navigate it, you will stay in the matrix. I was in the matrix for most of my life. I had no idea that socialization had any effect upon the way that I was feeling, thinking, behaving, believing. You can't be sure any of those things that I just mentioned are truly self-created, or if they were programmed by something else. So luckily, in this video, I'm going to tell you my story of becoming aware of my socialization and breaking free from the matrix. So to start off, I'm going to tell you my first real confrontation with socialization, which was when I was traveling in Indonesia with my twin brother this last summer. I was sitting at a coffee shop with him discussing our goals for the future. I came up with all these ideas of what I wanted to do. I was going to create a business in content creation and do a linked reading course or consulting or this other thing. But suddenly a coffee shop vendor sat down with us and started to tell us his life dream. His eyes were baggy, his back was sagging. He looked really tired. He told us that he loved this girlfriend of his and his family very much, and he wanted to make enough money in order to buy a house for them in Bali that they could live with him in. But in order to do that, he had to work for the next 5 years in this coffee shop in order to afford to buy the house. So my brother and I were like, no, there's gotta be another way. Like, you could start a business, you could go to school, you could do this, that. Every single one of our ideas, he shut down. I don't have enough time. I can't stop working here because otherwise I won't be able to afford rent. I already am super uneducated and it would take a long time to get the education necessary to do that. He couldn't do anything but work for those next 5 years. And it was then that I realized that it wasn't his fault that he was in this situation. It was the fact that I had certain social identities, which are identities we give to ourselves and from others in society, that were socialized into me and also innate that I had before I was born, that were giving me benefits that he did not have. For example, I had a US nationality, which is incredible for traveling to Indonesia because the exchange rate favors me so heavily. I literally had like Scrooge McDuck levels of wealth going to Indonesia, even though I'm just a college student, like jumping into a pile of gold. And also English was my first language, which gives me a big leg up in the cultural in the economic world because so much of business negotiations are done in English. And so much of the world speaks English. I'm not validating English as the dominant language. I'm just saying that's what happens to be. And because of that, also high socioeconomic status, of course. He, however, had low socioeconomic status, not a U.S. nationality, so the exchange rate doesn't favor him, and not English as a first language. None of these things were his fault. But because of my social identities and because of the way that I'd been socialized to see making a passive income, making a revenue stream that can help me separate my time from my work as what I wanted to do, those were the goals that I perceived in my future. Whereas his goals, the only thing he could perceive was working at the coffee shop for the next 5 years to buy a house for his girlfriend and his family. So it made me realize how we literally perceive the world differently. We have different feelings, thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors and subsequent outcomes because of our social identities and our socialization. So that was when I first confronted this idea. I've obviously experienced things like that in the past, but this was the first time where it really was consciously brought to me. I was mature enough to think about why that might have been the case instead of just unconsciously going about my day. The next question then becomes, why can socialization be bad? I'm not saying it's a net terrible thing, right? If I'm imagining in my head what would happen if no socialization was occurrent in society, and there would basically just be anarchy, right? Imagine if there was no socialization to say thank you to someone when they pass you something, or to be kind inherently most of the time. That wouldn't be good. But why can socialization be bad? Because answering this question will help us realize why we should try and make our socialization conscious in the first place. The first major reason is my side bias, which is a bias in psychology where we have a disinclination to leave a favored hypothesis when searching for and interpreting evidence. So at the group level, this describes our tendency to see our own group more favorably than other groups, simply because of the fact that they are part of another group. And when we are socialized to have certain groups that we affiliate with, say we're Christian. I grew up in a Christian town. I was always socialized to be atheist by my parents, but a lot of people in my town were Christian. Luckily, I was not socialized to hate people that weren't of the same religion as me. But let's say that you are, and you are socialized to see other groups as worse. And even if you're not, you might have an inherent bias towards other groups simply because they're part of another group. If you aren't aware of that, you aren't consciously understand that tendency, then you might do a lot of bad things to other people simply because they are part of another group. However, bringing that to consciousness, the fact that you have my side bias can help you overcome that tendency, which is the beautiful part of making a lot of socialization conscious, is it can allow you to overcome a lot of the biases that you have innately because they aren't unconscious anymore. Which brings us into the next major reason socialization can be bad, is it makes our human biases, heuristics, and emotional tendencies, it can make them remain unconscious. So a great example of this is the pluralistic ignorance, which is a psychological concept where a whole group of people believes in something that most people in the group actually don't believe. So a good example is at college, I think more people like drinking more than they do because it's such a noticeable thing to see people drinking. I mean, it's really obvious. There's like blaring noises everywhere. It's insanity, music. people shouting. Like, it's very obvious when people are drinking. It's not obvious when people are sitting in their room not drinking. So there's a pluralistic ignorance to think more people drink than they do. This is just one example of a thing that is created by society that we think is the case when it's actually not. And there are plethoras of other examples of human biases, heuristics, and emotional tendencies that would take me forever if I went into. So I'm not going to go into all of them. But the point is that when those remain unconscious, then we can't do something about them. And a lot of those, while not all of them are created by socialization, a lot of them are, like pluralistic ignorance. So the third reason that socialization can be bad is that socialization is a large reason for why in Western society we are experiencing a meaning crisis right now. And one of the reasons that I say that is because of a lecture series that I've been watching on YouTube that has been absolutely incredible and influential in a lot of my thinking. And that is Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which you can watch up above. It's a series that dives into why we're experiencing a meaning crisis inside of the West right now, and how we can learn to once again figure out what comprises meaning, and how is meaning related to wisdom, rationality, a term he uses in the lecture series a lot, relevance realization, loneliness, and more. And how can we, by understanding that and applying it into our lives, find meaning again? So how does socialization make us sometimes struggle to find meaning? Well, one of the major things that in Western society we are socialized to do is confuse our having needs with our being needs. Our having needs are things that we need to have in order to survive. Things like food, water, shelter. As far as I can tell, nobody can survive without those. Now, please tell me in the comments if you have found someone that can do that, because that's pretty sick, not gonna lie. But pretty sure we need to have those. However, our being needs are things that we need to become in order to feel, how do I say this? Spiritually satisfied. Things like becoming mature, becoming grateful, becoming courageous. The problem is, in a lot of Western society, we have been socialized to confuse the two together. Think about how many ads you've seen that try and make a product seem like it fulfills a being need, like a Porsche that makes you become mature, right? A lot of the time when you see Porsche ads, they're like, show a person that looks super cool and they're like, yeah. Or Red Bull gives you wings, as if like drinking Red Bull will allow you to fulfill your dreams and desires. So stupid, right? It's like, no, why would any of those things do that? But this doesn't just happen in ads. This pervades into the rest of society. So many people confuse these two needs together, unconsciously or consciously, and it causes them to neglect the being needs for the having needs. I'm not saying that one is more important than the other. It's just that we are prioritizing having needs too much because of our socialization. And another thing that is contributing to the meaning crisis is we have lost our relationship with virtue and growth of our characters. This is talked not only in the lecture series I just mentioned, but also in a book by David Brooks called The Road to Character, which discusses how we used to, in American society, have a rich culture of character growth, especially during World War I and World War II, moral character was talked about a lot among children and their parents. Not everywhere, obviously, but it was talked about a lot more than it is today. And this is a problem because humans fundamentally have a need to grow. It is, in my opinion, a fundamental need. Think about how aversive it feels to stagnate as a person. Have you ever seen an old friend and asked them how they're doing if you haven't seen them during the summer, and they say like, same old, just doing the exact same thing, didn't do anything. It doesn't feel good to hear that. We naturally incline towards growth, towards growth. And because we've lost this culture of growing our character, it's been very aversive to finding meaning in our lives, right? Almost nobody that I know talks about character growth with friends and family and strangers or other people, right? There's just not. Instead, we talk about the weather or schoolwork if you're at college, or just very much stuff in propositional and procedural knowledge, not perspectival or participatory. We don't talk about spiritual matters as much, philosophical matters. And if it is philosophy, it's not about character growth. It's about like niche stuff that doesn't apply into the real world. So that's another problem of socialization, is socialization has caused that to happen because we're socialized not to talk about that stuff. And you have to break past socialization in order to be able to talk about that. Then another danger of socialization is stereotype threat. We have a lot of stereotypes for people in society. And all stereotypes usually have a grain of truth to them. That's how they came about. But most of the time, they're super generalizable, and on the individual level, they are not true. The problem is stereotype threat, which is when somebody will fulfill a stereotype for a certain social identity or mix of social identities they have, which I will define more clearly later on. I know that term might be a little confusing, but once again, it's identities we give to ourselves and from others in society. So just some really quick examples, things like race, age, disability, body size. Those are some examples. Stereotype threat is when you fulfill one of the stereotypes for a specific social identity or mix of social identities. So a great example is there have been many studies where women, if they are reminded of the stereotype that women are bad drivers before driving, will actually do worse on a driving test, which is insane if you think about it. It's like, why should that impact how good of a driver they are in the moment? But it does, which is crazy that it does. And that's stereotype threat. I think only by uncovering how much socialization impacts the stereotypes we have can we break through that stereotype threat, where we can see people for more than just the stereotypes that they are. Now, a fifth reason socialization can be bad is because of loneliness. There is a loneliness crisis right now. A ton of people are struggling in the US to feel intimate human connection with people, which is a massive problem because loneliness is one of the best ways that you can kill yourself. I'm not joking. Like it is literally worse health-wise than smoking like a pack of cigarettes a day. And socialization has caused this in a way, can't prove it fully, because we have lost the skills to form genuine human connections with others. Shouldn't have say lost, because a lot of people just haven't learned those skills in the first place. And this shows up in two different reasons, which is, firstly, people don't know how to talk to others in a way that will lead to intimate conversation. I definitely was at fault of this myself, because before I came to college, I was very uncharismatic. I grew up in a small rural town where I had the same friends basically ever since I was a little kid. So I never had to develop the skills of learning to form new friendships. Women would come up to me in my first year of college. They would say, like, "How are you doing?" And I'd be like, your parents still alive? Open casket, closed casket. So I did not have the skills to form intimate human connections, because partly of my socialization, which had led me not to have conversations that would be about deep stuff. It was rather about video games and about the weather, and about very surface level shisa, instead of the genuine human connection over values, stories, and other stuff. And another reason socialization can lead to loneliness is because you're unwilling to talk with people of different social identities or different groups, like going back to stereotype threat and my side bias. If you've been socialized to not interact with people like that, then it's very hard to form a genuine human connection in that way. So socialization can lead to loneliness if you're not careful. And then lastly is, and there's obviously way more reasons socialization can be bad, but these are the main ones I'm talking about. Lastly is closed-mindedness. Closed-mindedness can be caused by socialization because socialization teaches you to have certain feelings, thoughts, beliefs, behaviors characteristically. For example, a really good example of mine is, because of my socialization, I was never surrounded by very many Black students. There were almost none inside of the school that I grew up in. There was, I think, one. It was insane. So I wasn't socialized to see Black students as someone that I could openly interact with, because anytime I saw them, I was like, well, I've never talked to Black students before. I don't know how to talk to them, which is crazy. It's like, just go up and talk to them like a normal person. But because of that, I was very closed-minded when I got to Cornell about talking with people of other social identities, until I started to take classes and join clubs that had people of these different social identities. And I was forced to interact with them. And I realized, wow, they're incredible. And there's literally no reason that I should not be interacting with these people. So my mind was opened. But closed-mindedness doesn't just show up in your relationships with people. It also shows up in the ideas the beliefs that you're willing to accept, the rituals you're willing to do. So, for example, if you're socialized to believe that happiness is all about pleasure, then you're going to be closed-minded against any ideas that are against that. Like, happiness is about being virtuous or about giving out to others, right? And I would argue that could lead to a lot of bad things. Check out my happiness video if you want to see why. So socialization can keep you inside of the characteristic feelings, thoughts, beliefs, behaviors that you've always been socialized to believe are the way, which hurts open-mindedness. So we've talked about why socialization can be bad. Now let's talk about how socialization occurs in the first place, so that we can get to understand how we can break free from it towards the end of the video. The core idea that I want you to get from what I'm about to tell you is that your environment profoundly shapes your cognition, right? We tend to have this very individualistic notion of cognition in America, which is that it is solely in the brain and it does not exude itself into the outside world. However, what you're going to see as I tell you about the cycle of socialization is how much of an effect the outside world has on what's going on in here. So, what is the cycle of socialization? It has four main components. I lied to you. Firstly, the beginning. Secondly, first socialization. Thirdly, institutional and cultural structures. And fourthly, enforcement/rules. So firstly, socialization occurs in the beginning, which is the institutional, cultural, socioeconomic, religious, and political backdrop that you're in before you're born. It's not in your control at all. Then continues on to first socialization, which is your first individual contact with parents, friends, teachers, and strangers. So you can think about this on an individual, interpersonal level, rather than on a larger institutional or systemic scale, which leads us to the third stage of institutional and cultural structures, where you are impacted by schools, medicine, police force, stores, and more. Finally, this is all enforced by punishments and rewards, which perpetuate systems of socialization. It's important to note that this is not a linear process. It's not like you're first impacted by parents, friends, teachers, and strangers, and then like later on in life, you're impacted by school, institutional, cultural structures. This is happening codependently at the same time in a very cyclical fashion. So you can't easily separate them out from each other. And what this cycle creates, before I get to that, now you can see how much of an impact your environment shapes your cognition. Because think about how different the cycle of socialization is going to be depending upon where you're born in. Like going back to my beginning example of getting coffee and talking with my brother at the Indonesian coffee shop, the Indonesian coffee vendor had an entirely different cycle of socialization than I did, because his institutional, cultural, socioeconomic, religious, and political backdrop was different. His first socialization was different. His institutional and cultural structures were different. Enforcement/rules were different. His environment was fundamentally not the same, which profoundly shaped his characteristic feelings, thoughts, beliefs, behaviors, and therefore outcomes. Now, what this cycle creates and it enforces is social identities. And this is where I'm going to dive more into what social identities are and how they play a part in socialization, which I've mentioned briefly beforehand. What social identities are the identities we give to ourselves and from others in society. They are constructed, not innate. They're not natural aspects of the universe, of the cosmos. Humans created them, right? And they're also context dependent. So a social identity might give you advantages in one place, one context, but it might be a disadvantage in another. Context dependent. They're intersectional, which means combinations of social identities can lead to different effects than those social identities in isolation. So the social identity of having a US nationality combined with the first language of English, can intersect to be entirely different than what those would be like on their own. And finally, social identities are reinforced by power dynamics, privilege, and oppression. So, first off, why are social identities so important to recognize? It's because there are social identities that are dominant and subdominant. And dominant social identities tend to give you unknown privilege. Subdominant social identities tend to give you disadvantages, which are often a lot more obvious than the unknown advantages dominant social identities give you. If you're unconscious about these, then, like we have been for most of history, it can lead to a lot of problems, put simply. So becoming conscious of them on an individual level is a first step to being able to fight against dominant and subdominant social identities. Try and help those that have been oppressed for a large amount of history. So what are some examples of social identities before we get into dominant versus subdominant? I'm just going to run through a list. Age, religion, gender, body size, race, ethnicity, nationality, first language, sex, socioeconomic status, disability. These are all the most obvious social identities, but there are obviously more that I just haven't gone into. So this list is not comprehensive by any means. Now that you know how to identify your social identities, maybe even after watching this video or right now, you could go through and figure out what are your social identities inside of those. So, for example, for age, I'm 20. How old are you? For religion, what religion are you? What's your gender? What's your body size? Figure out where you fall on each of those, and it'll make this next section a lot more clear and interesting. Dominant versus subdominant social identities. So as I said earlier, dominant social identities give us unknown privilege, whereas subdominant social identities give us known disadvantages. So some good examples of dominant social identities that I have are my identity of being a US national and my identity of having a muscular mid-sized body. So the US national identity played a role in the beginning story I started this video with because I have such an advantage in the exchange rates between the US and Indonesia. It favors me much more than it does someone who is of a Indonesian nationality. And secondly, my muscular mid-sized body gives me a ton of advantage in society. For example, the halo effect, which is a psychological effect where people assume attractive or muscular people somehow are better on other traits as well. For example, in intelligence or kindness, which has definitely helped me at many points in my life. I'm also just generally, people are nicer to me. People are less nice to those that have a higher body size because it's sometimes assumed that they're lazier. So these dominant social identities give me unknown privilege, whereas subdominant social identities give us known disadvantages. So for example, girls having a harder time getting into CS, particularly in America. And interestingly, the reason for this is, first off, like right now, there's just a big bias of guys being in computer science rather than girls. So girls feel pressured not to go into computer science because they're like, well, I don't see any girls in here. Why would I join? Funnily enough, I recently learned that the reason for this is not because girls are worse at computer science innately than guys. It's because when computers were first being marketed widely in the 1980s, they were marketed mostly as guy toys rather than girl toys. So what ended up happening is guys would get computers into their rooms in high school, middle school, start using them, playing with them, and girls would not. when they got to college, guys would genuinely have more computer science skills because they'd been using computers in middle school and high school. So they'd start doing better in classes. Girls would feel like they weren't good enough to stay and they would drop out, leading to this big bias. So you can see how arbitrary and how this is a perfect example of how social identities are constructed, and the effects that they give, the advantages and disadvantages they give are not innate. They are also constructed, which means that we can deconstruct them as well. Now, we find it harder to see our dominant social identities compared to our subdominant because of the headwinds, tailwinds effect, which is the idea that we tend to see the disadvantages we have more saliently because they're obvious compared to the advantages. When I am advantaged in some way by my social identities, then I don't notice the times where I would have been disadvantaged had I not had those social identities. So I end up being very ignorant to my dominant social identities and very salient about my subdominant social identities. And finally, I want to go back to the point on intersectionality about social identities, because what makes a dominant social identity versus subdominant social identity isn't just what social identity individually you have, but also what intersection of social identities you have. What can be dominant, what can be subdominant can change depending upon that. So now that we've talked about subdominant and dominant social identities, how does socialization persist over time, right? Like, why has the dominant and subdominant social identities, why do they stay the same or change as history plays out? It's because of four main types of discrimination. Those are interpersonal discrimination, institutional discrimination, systemic discrimination, and structural discrimination. So I'll go through each of those in turn. Interpersonal discrimination is discrimination between people. There is a there's a discriminatory act and a discriminatory person. So in this form of discrimination, it's kind of like you can think of it as the lowest level. There is someone that's actually discriminatory and clearly doing a discriminatory act against someone else. So that's the first way socialization persists these dominant and subdominant social identities. However, one thing that blew my mind before I learned more about this topic is that there can be discrimination without a discriminatory person, right? And the reason for that is because discrimination can be inside of society itself, which we can see in the next level of discrimination, institutional discrimination. This is discrimination on the level of a single institution like education or healthcare or into like healthcare and education. So a type of discrimination here might be the laws that used to be in the South that made it so you had to take literacy tests in order to vote. Not seemingly discriminatory. It's just like everyone has to take a literacy test, and if they pass, they can vote. Problem is, most blacks in those South places weren't literate, so they couldn't vote, which then biased a lot of the people that got elected to have goals that were better for other races. So there was no person that was purposely being discriminatory. It was just in the very institution itself of lawmaking that this discrimination was happening. Then we have systemic discrimination, which is when the discrimination inside a single point in an institution systemically impacts later points in that same institution. So a good example is in education, with particularly salient example to me is advanced classes in school. This is a type of discrimination, institutional discrimination, that has systemic effects later on. Advanced class, in 6th grade, ever since 6th grade, I was in the advanced math classes and other advanced classes at school because I did amazing on the fraction test in 5th grade. So they let me into the advanced the advanced math classes. So stupid. Now, without realizing it, this was actually discriminatory, because what happens is all the people that were in the advanced classes tended to be professors' kids, because in our school, we had a mix of professors' kids and more farm kids, because in my rural hometown, there was Colgate University, the college, a lot of professors working there with kids that would send their kids to the Hamilton, which was the school I was at. And then there was a lot of surrounding parents in the countryside that send their kids as well. Because the professors' kids tended to have socialization that would make them have more vocabulary, more prone to focusing on education because their parents have high education, we tended to get into the advanced classes early on, which would then give us systemic benefits later on in the education process, because we got compounding benefits from being in the advanced classes. We got more material, better teachers, better teaching, and this allowed us to get into better colleges, therefore better colleges down the line. And that's a systemic discrimination right there. But it gets even more mind-boggling, because then it opens up into structural discrimination, which is the last and biggest level. This is where systems start to connect together in their discrimination. So in the education example I just shared, the fact that I got into a better college because of getting into advanced classes when I was younger allows me to get into a better job in the workforce, which lets me get more money, which might give me more opportunities to do other things in other institutions, like afford better healthcare. So you can see how this starts to just explode into effects. And this is how socialization persists over time, is through interpersonal, institutional, systemic, and structural discrimination. So I hope you're starting to see how mind-blowing this was when I learned it. Like, I realized my entire life was a lie when I'd heard this, because I had previously thought all of my work and success in life was because of like the work that I'd done, the hard work that I put in. And now I'm realizing, yeah, that hard work has merit still, but I also have literally every dominant social identity you could possibly have. Like, I'm not going to run through every single one, but it was really funny. The class that taught me at Cornell a lot about this socialization, intergroup dialogue, I should have mentioned it earlier, but there's a part of that class where we had to talk about our subdominant social identities, and I couldn't think of one. I don't have any subdominant social identities. So me becoming aware of that has been very helpful in making me a more empathetic, kind human being that now wants to try and help disadvantaged social identities come up and break the cycle of socialization, which is exactly what we're going to talk about now, is how to break free from socialization and social identity. And before I get into this, I'm going to talk more about this from an individual level, because I'm only 20 and I don't know how to break this at a societal level, let alone comprehensively at an individual one, right? This video is not meant to be like the magnum opus of socialization. It's just me getting you to think about these ideas because of how important they are. So, one thing that I will preface this with before I start this section is you should watch my video, School is a Matrix, Here's How to Get Out, if you are in school and interested in this idea of socialization, because that's a whole video about socialization specifically applied to the school context. So, one big tip that I can give you is to remodel your information diet more intentionally to break free from socialization, right? A massive part of how we are socialized is from the information we consume. Because from an early age, our parents, I'm not going to go into everything again, but we're taught to consume certain types of information depending upon our socialization. So for me, that when I was young was a lot of video games, a lot of YouTube food reviews. I was a weird kid. A lot of anime and a lot of Netflix, right? Not proud of that, but and your information diet, like your physical diet, profoundly affects your mental and physical health and how you think, feel, behave, right? Everything that I'd said before. So if you want to break free from socialization individually, remodel your information diet more intentionally. Don't get yourself in an echo chamber of information, which is where you're consuming all about one topic or from one person, and you become closed-minded because of that. So what I've done to try and break more intentionally consume information is I've created a collect toolkit, which is a set of 3 to 5 information mediums that I try and stick to for most of my information consumption that I think are high quality. And inside of those mediums, I choose quality creators to consume from and a wide variety of them on a wide variety of topics. So the mediums that I consume from mostly are books, podcasts, conversation. Long-form mediums that are all very good for critically, really consuming an idea. They're not short-form mediums like freaking TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. I am on Twitter, but I don't consume super large amount of information from Twitter, right? These long-form mediums let me grapple with ideas critically. And then inside of those mediums, I'm consuming a variety of creators, not just 1 or 2 or 3, with a variety of different topics. Oftentimes, multiple creators on the same topic to get different perspectives. So this helps me break free from socialization by getting out of echo chambers and seeing multiple perspectives on an idea. Next, this doesn't just apply to information on information digitally sense. This also applies to relationships, right? It's a weird way to say it, but you can think of your relationships also as giving you information as well. Like, what people are you consuming? I should not say it like that. What people are you allowing into your life to give you information, right? Are these people socializing you in a particular way that's negative? What I recommend is you find a challenge group. A challenge group is a group of people that is not willing to question you on certain avenues. They're willing to debate, they're willing to dialogue, they're willing to discuss with you. And they have different values from you, they have different beliefs. Sometimes, obviously, to a certain degree, like ideally, you'll have people that you actually enjoy being around. Like my friends, for instance, in order to be friends with me, you need to be open-minded, curious, and you need to be trying to help me become the person I want to become rather than the person you want me to become, right? That's kind of it, honestly. Like, I used to think friends needed to have the same values as you. Now I'm much more open-minded about that because I want to break free from socialization. I have a 50-year-old friend at Cornell. I have a asexual friend, girl, like breaking free from the stereotype that guys can't be friends with girls. It's so stupid. I have a Filipino friend. I have a black friend. Like, just all of these different social identities that are helping me break free from my socialization. Once again, and they're all willing to challenge me when I say stupid stuff, which is a lot of the time, a surprisingly large amount of the time. Next, create your, it tied in with that, break stereotypes, right? If you unearth your hidden biases and stereotypes of people. I used to, as I said, have a bias against Black people because I didn't really have any in my hometown, right? So recognize that and try and get in situations where you might be able to overcome that bias, right? Interact with people that you haven't interacted before because you think you have a certain stereotype with them. Next is do new things, right? It's a great way to break free from socialization is just to do new things that your socialization doesn't make you do, right? I think that's kind of self-explanatory of how that would break you out of socialization. And the last thing that I'm going to mention, and one of the most important, is to create your own vision and goals for your life using lifestyle design. Lifestyle design is the art of creating and adapting the best possible life for you. And the main way that I do it is through daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly reviews in Obsidian. I journal daily, write down what I'm grateful for, feelings, thoughts, biggest wins, story-worthy moment, and other stuff. And doing these reviews over time helps me unearth my hidden biases, patterns for how I feel, think, behave, which in turn helps me see my socialization. Because what did I say before? Socialization is your characteristic, is how you're socialized to characteristically feel, think, behave, act in believe in certain ways. So doing lifestyle design is a profoundly great way to unearth all of those socialization tendencies. So if you resonated with the ideas that I'm talking about in this video, that's why I recommend you check out my video on lifestyle design, which I have linked up above, to learn how to do that yourself, because it's going to be crucial to breaking free from socialization and social identities. So wrapping up this video, I really want you to take away how socialization affects your characteristic ways of feeling, thinking, believing, and behaving, and how it's not over, right? You can unearth your socialization because it can be bad. It can cause my side bias. It can cause your human biases, heuristics, and emotional tendencies to remain unconscious. It can cause the meaning crisis that we have right now. It can cause stereotype threat and loneliness and closed-mindedness. And without being conscious of it, we can't see how that happens. We can't stop that. Well, not stop it from happening, but try and work around it. And socialization occurs through the cycle of socialization, which creates social identities that can be dominant or subdominant. And this is persisted through interpersonal, institutional, systemic, and structural discrimination. But there is hope, because as I just explained, we can break free from it through the methods that I just discussed. So I hope that you leave this video more aware, as I was brought very aware from this experience, and that you check out my lifestyle design video. As always, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and bye-bye.